Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Humanities, SOH. Diploma in Creative Writing in English, DCE. DCE 03 Short Story. Block 1 Basic Elements of a Short Story. Unit 4 Narration. 4.0 Aims and Objectives. This unit aims at telling you about one very important aspect of the writing of short stories: narration. Since narration is an important element of several other forms of literature as well, you will here learn about the distinctive mode which a writer of short stories has to adopt, and the constraints which this genre imposes on him. The narrative strategies employed by the great masters of fiction in the writing of short stories. The difference between narration in a full-length novel and that in a short story. And, finally, the different modes of narration used by the great Russian and French masters, and the great practitioners of this genre in English. All this should help you in choosing the narrative mode for your own specific needs. 4.1 Introduction. In the preceding 3 units of this block, you have learned something about the important elements of the short story, namely plot structure, atmosphere and character. The present unit will discuss another basic element: narration. Narration. In the short story, it is easy to see, is different from that in the novel or other types of narrative writing. One can learn a great deal about this art by studying the short stories of the great masters. Remember that narration in the short story is more closely linked with its other elements than it is in other forms of writing. One might even say that it is the atmosphere, or the character, or the plot which determines the narrative mode in the short story. 4.2 The art of the short story. The story is one of the most ancient forms of literature. It is almost as ancient as the conscious use of human speech. Stories in oral form have been circulating for thousands of years, and even their written story is an ancient form. But the short story, as a well-defined subgenre, is a modern literary form, and epics have stories in them, and tragedies, comedies, and the novel tell a story or many stories at the same time. But the short story breaks off from all of them and acquires its own distinct form. In Ekand Literat Fire, this may be said to have happened the 19th century. Various explanations have been given for the rise of the short story, among them, the lack of hay for reading a full-length novel as life became busier and busier. Obviously, this is not a reason, but a rationalization, for the novel has continued to flourish at the same time as the short story. Storytelling is an one of interest, the creation of suspense, the satisfaction of the end and read, are all techniques based on the use of language, or style. The short story has inherited, after some modifications, some of these modes of narration. 4th February 2001 Characteristics of narration in the short story. In order to define the characteristic narrative mode of the short story, you can use the words compression, brevity and pointedness, but none of them really gets to the heart of the matter. It is not something we know already that is being compressed by means of style. The effect of compression is really in the fee of expanding into life which a short story, on at completion, induces. There is more of life in a short story than it actually presents. It is this greater life expanding into our consciousness by means of the style that produces a sense of authenticity and richness. 4th February 2002 The difference between narrative methods of the novel and the short story. The narrative muse of the short story is annihilation, a discovery that answers the challenge and musique of brevity. There is a difference between the events and episodes in a novel and thw in a short story. In the novels of Dickens and Thackeray, which used to be published SDY, there was a strong element of episode. Each chunk of the while had to provide its own satisfaction, as well as when the appetite and the ground for what was to follow. The finality, The definiteness of style in the short story springs from the fact that there is nothing to follow, nothing to fall back upon, no further space of life to look forward to. The end of the story is the end, it is either achievement or failure. The style of the novel has a rhythm of peaks and valleys, it may meander its way through life. The great novelists, Dickens and Hardy, too have written short stories which, however, do not achieve the status of a true short story. This is because of the inherent relaxation that comes into their work from a feeling of the amplitude of time available. The narrative style of the short story is all peaks, no valleys. It is all achievement, completedness here and now, within the confines of the story. This imposes attention on its style, a tautness from beginning to end. All forms of writing have a unity, a beginning, a middle and an end, but the short story, the most modern among them, has this unity raised to a higher level. It is not a unity of different parts, a flow of unity between beginning and end, but it is the overwhelming unity of a piece of life, self-contained. It is in this sense that the style of every short story must communicate the sense of a discovery. Just as the journalist finds a story, the short story writer also finds his piece, fully formed in his imagination, eager to find its way into his words before the freshness, the first sharpness of its taste vanishes. 4. 3. The Russian and the French. Short story, Chekhov and Guy de Maupassant. Therefore, the style of the short story demands both objectivity and suggestiveness. From the beginning to the end, the short story must convey a unifying sense. Of the two classic virtues of objectivity and suggestiveness, there are two exponents among the international masters of short story, Guy de Maupassant and Anton Chekhov. If you think of stories like A Piece of String or That Pig, Morin, you get a sense of that transparency towards objective life, which is, in fact, a sign of the highest art. It seems subservient to reality and it implies mastery over it. Among the novelists, Tolstoy has this transparency in such abundant measure that what looks like superficial and superfluous detail is actually the core of life that Tolstoy perceives with crystalline clarity. In the stories of Maupassant and Chekhov, there is nowhere any sense of hurry, effort, manipulation or an excessive energy in pointing to the basic insight of the story. Obviousness, effort, pointing the finger at an effect, are marks of second-rateness in a short story. That is what makes the difference between Maupassant and Chekhov on the one hand, and O. Henry on the other. The naturalness of style of a short story lies in the realization that the event narrated is organically linked with the structure and style of the story. The language should be in keeping with the event, and the event translucent with the meaningfulness of the style. 4.4 The narrative mode of great short story writers in English. You are aware that in literary tradition, French is closer to English than Russian, and that is why Maupassant has been a more influential model than Chekhov. 4th April 2001 Edgar Allan Poe, Atmosphere. Among the earliest masters of the short story in English is Edgar Allan Poe. For many reasons, cultural and political, the American intellectual has been close to French literary influence as an obvious counterbalance to his Anglo-Saxon character, and Poe is both a theoretician and an intellectual, an artist and a practitioner. He is conscientious as well as gifted. Qualities of successful narration may be seen exemplified in Poe's The Purloined Letter. It is a detective story, and such a story is invariably concerned with an event, and a discovery, a peak of solution. The storyteller is often a character, himself. His flippancy, his ratiocination are a match to the characters of the story he portrays. The story has a narrator and confident a recipient both of its narrative and its ratiocination. Consider the opening paragraph of the story. At Paris, just after one dark, gusty evening in the autumn of 18, I was enjoying the twofold luxury of meditation and a meerschaum, in company with my friend C. Auguste Dupin, in his little back library, or book closet, au troisième, no. 33 Rue d'Anoch, Faubourg Street. Germain. For 1 hour at least we had maintained a profound silence, while each, to any casual observer, might have seemed intently and exclusively occupied with the curling eddies of smoke that oppressed the atmosphere of the chamber. This is the flesh and blood of life which makes a story real. A place and time, both not only mentioned with appropriate precision, but given distinct character. A dark gusty evening when it is a pleasure to be indoors, in a confined space, familiar, warm, habitual, a library in the fashionable quarter of Faubourg Street Germain in Paris, the center of the civilized world. The details of sophisticated luxury are the physical counterpart of the elegant mental world which the characters of the purloined lettering habit. This shows not only the delicate artistry of Poe but the spirit of being in keeping with the place, the time, the circumstances of life, which is the key to the style of his short stories. Arthur Conan Doyle, with his world-famous Sherlock Holmes, is a literary descendant of Edgar Allan Poe. Sherlock Holmes, like Dupin, is an odd character, a connoisseur of tobacco. They both like surprise and paradox, which are, however, not necessary to the style of the short story, though they are the characteristics of this particular short story. This brings us to the point that the narration has to be appropriate to the discovery, the story which the short story incorporates. The style has to be infinitely malleable, responsive, delicately suggestive, and in intuitive sympathy with the process of life within the short story. Dupin says, I dispute the availability and thus the value of that reason which is cultivated in any special form, other than the abstractly logical. I dispute in particular the reason deduced by mathematical study. From which Poe, in the character of Dupin, goes on to say something extremely relevant to the short story. If the minister had been no more than a mathematician, the prefect would have been under no necessity of giving me this check. I knew him, however, as both mathematician and poet. Both mathematician and poet, that is the crux of the problem of narration in the short story, a balance of technique and imagination appropriate to the event, crystallized, the leading to an insight into the nature of life and human character. Poe kept his intellectual powers and suggestive imagination in compartments, for the writing of stories of two types, a detective story and the tale of atmosphere. The Conan Doyle stories, by their style, create the atmosphere of a world and a character so odd and individual that his fiction creates the illusion of reality. 4th April 2002, Somerset Maugham. Conscious art. All short story writers do not necessarily think about style, but at least one outstanding writer, Somerset Maugham, has both thought about style and written remarkably good short stories. In style and structure, the stories of Maud Mary models of lucidity, of that twist of event which at one turn records an insight into human life and character. Apparently, and in their technical skill, his stories seem to deal as little with atmosphere as possible. But that apparent impression is only due to the fact that we think of atmosphere in one particular way. Just as there is a limited sense to the word poetic, there is a sense of atmosphere which limits it to the description of nature, or of an interior, or of an emotional situation predominantly of one tone, and in that sense the stories of Maugham have little atmosphere. Maugham writes about the usual mix of human nature which has its own complexity, and with the neutral clarity and sharpness of his eye he lends to his story a distinct artistic style. Take, for instance, the feeling and tone of dislike in his story Mr. Noel. It has a negative atmosphere of positive dislike like the title of the story itself. The atmosphere of the disagreeable is built up slowly out of innumerable small details, petty in themselves, but reinforcing the total effect of moral discomfort arising out of physical details. Like Poe, Maugham specified the period quality. The war had just finished and the passenger traffic in the ocean-going liner was heavy. It is the milieu of cosmopolitan travel between the First and Second World Wars. Atmosphere is sometimes a matter of class atmosphere, a difference not only of the rich and the poor but of the 100 different things which make up social caste, the world of snobbery. The description of Max Calder's luggage is vivid. When I went on board I found Mr. Calder's luggage already below. I did not like the look of it, there were too many labels on the suitcases, and the wardrobe TNRK was too big. He had unpacked his toilet things, and I observed he was a patron of the excellent Mr. Coty, for I saw on the washing stand his scent, his hair wash, and his brilliantine. Mr. Calder's brushes, Ebony with his monogram in gold would have been all the better for a scrub. Max Calder is ostentatiously rich and dirty. A kind of racial prejudice. The prejudice against the un-English is made vivid, almost as a matter of taste. Again, as in the case of the luggage, the distaste is against a physical type. King George has many strange subjects. Mr. Calder was short and of a sturdy build, clean-shaven and dark-skinned, with a fleshy, hooked nose and very large, lustrous and liquid eyes. His long black hair was sleek and curly. He spoke with a fluency in which there was nothing English, and his gestures were exuberant. Mogham's command of the idiom of dislike, the language of snobbery, is used with impressive competence, indeed with such thoroughness that the event of the short story produces a mixed effect of bewilderment. The gist of the story is that Ramsay, an American in the consular service, is returning to Kobe with his wife, pretty Mrs. Ramsay has been alone in New York for a year and is going back with Ramsay. Max Calder is an expert on pearls, and just by way of illustration he points to a chain Mrs. Ramsay is wearing and says, "You take my word for it, Mrs. Ramsay, that chain you are wearing will never be worth a cent less than it is now." Mrs. Ramsay guilty slips the chain inside her dress. Ramsay wants to know how much Calder thinks it is worth and he values it at around $15,000, whereupon Ramsay says that his wife bought it for a mere $18. There is a heated argument and a bet on whether it is real or imitation. But after taking the bet, Calder examines the pearls, and while examining them, he looks at Mrs. Ramsay. He turns around and says the pearls are imitation and pays up his $100. Mogham describes the effort that Calder has to make in reversing his stand and bearing up under Ramsay's taunts on his experience. The denouement of the short story is the anonymous return of the $100 Calder had lost in the bet. The pearls were they were payment for Mrs. Ramsay's infidelity, and Max Calder, having read the story in her face, was decent enough to lose his bet, and lose face rather than show her up a case of unexpected decency, a touch of pity for a poor woman in a hard situation. The land of the story, Somerset Maughams' about turn, is, at that moment I did not entirely dislike Mr. Calder. He reached out for his pocket book and carefully put in it the $100 note. Maughams' men and women are real and realists. One may, under the pressure of pity and decency, be prepared to lose $100, but a $100 note is a $100 note. There is a compact, modern simplicity and economy in Maughams' style, an emphasis on vivid and exact visual detail, and a sense of the spoken idiom in which his men and women not only conduct the ordinary business of their life but by which they express their nature and what they value. The overall sense of dislike Somerset Maugham records is an aspect of social snobbery. It must be accepted as part of the limits of Maugham's horizon as an artist that our feeling is that he does not disagree with this dislike of Calder. In fact, the skill and finish of Maugham's stories are based on a limited but firmly held view of life. That in the mean and unpleasant, some quirk of circumstance may force us to discover an unexpected bit of humanity is the turn which is the find of the story, isn't it essentially a moral quest in an immoral world? 4th April 2003 D.H. Lawrence, Delineation of the Mystery and Complexity of Life. D.H. Lawrence is a great novelist and, like many novelists, has also written short stories. In fact, the greatness of Lawrence as a novelist has put his short stories in the shade, though on their own merit they deserve a much higher position. Perhaps the emphasis on his philosophy of life instead of art in his novels has tended to place them in the forefront. But the artistic merit of his short stories also places him very high among modern English writers. His vision of human life is indeed wider and deeper than Maugham's. He commanded the inflection of idiom to uncover the psychic complexities of human beings is so genuinely creative that it is almost impossible to discuss it concretely without going through some short story from beginning to end. For instance, one has only to go through Street More to see the depth and complexity of life, all presented within the limits of a story. As to the mystery of experience, and the quality of mysterious experience called atmosphere, a reading of the last laugh will help to enlarge our consciousness of what the short story is capable of doing in that direction. Even a minor talent like Catherine Mansfield is gifted with the frail faculty of surprising us out of our settled outlook on small everyday things so that the barrier between poetry and the short story vanishes for an instant. We then look through events, and beyond them to the sense of wonder which is not dependent on any event, but is released by the power of language to suggest and liberate. The world of children is a fairy world in itself, even without fairy tales, and the cold clash between the make-believe dreams of sun and moon and their parents is a window on the imaginative life of the artist which seems sometimes to be entirely forgotten and lost in the clutter of the appearance of reality. But oh! What had happened? The ribbons and roses were all pulled untied. The little red table napkins lay on the floor, all the shining plates were dirty and all the winking faces. The lovely food that the man had trimmed was all thrown about, and there were bones and bits and fruit peels and shells everywhere. There was even a little bottle lying down with stuff coming out of it on the cloth and nobody stood it up again. There is an effortless limpidness in this sight of a common enough reality. But Son's reaction is, though typical of a child's response, a surprise, a break-in on the acceptance of the tawdriness of some real things, because we take so little account of the view that children carry of things. But Son did not move from the door. Suddenly he put up his head and gave a cowed wail. "I think it's homed, horrid homed," he sobbed. Unless we sometimes become as little children, it may be difficult to enter even the world of the artist which we erroneously take to be an entirely adult preserve. 4th April 2004 James Joyce, The Autonomy of Style. There is an intimate link between the short stories of James Joyce, the Dubliners, and his great novel Ulysses. The Dublin pictures of the life of frustrated imagination have the potential of branching out into the whole landscape of the city, physical, intellectual and spiritual. What we usually think of as style in any literary sense exists in its own right in the short stories of Joyce. And, indeed, that style has a rightful place in the short story as in the novel, given the depth and richness of situation which may require such a style to do it justice. Joyce is a great experimenter and practitioner of style, and even his intimate knowledge of the frustration that imaginative richness of style may suffer from the poverty of human circumstances, is itself a suitable subject for such style. Even common life hankers for style is what imagination and art can make of our drab, common language. Here is a passage from his A Painful Case. She asked him, why did he not write out his thoughts? For what? He asked her, with careful scorn. To compete with phrasemongers, incapable of thinking consecutively for 60 seconds. To submit himself to the criticisms of an obtuse middle class which entrusted its morality to policemen and its fine art to impresarios. Her companionship was like a warm soil about an exotic plant. Many times she allowed the dark to fall upon them, refraining from lighting the lamp. 4th April 2005 Hemingway, A Rigorous and Bare Style. This account of narration in the short story may be ended with a reference, however brief, to a great and modern stylist whose application of the rigorous and experiments of style applied to the novel appear to have great relevance to the growth of style inside the form of the short story. A Day's Wear is a story about a boy Schatz and his temperature. Back in the room I wrote the boy's temperature down and made a note of the time to give the various capsules. His face was very white and there were dark areas under his eyes. He lay still in the bed and seemed very detached from what was going on. Then there's a diversion to the world outside the impressions of the father independent of the boy and his temperature. It was a bright, cold day, the ground covered with a sleet that had frozen so that it seemed as if all the bare ground had been varnished with ice. This is an original, clean, objective first-hand impression. When he goes back to the house, the boy is in a state he asks out of the blue. About what time do you think I'm going to die? He asked. What? About how king will it be before I die? You aren't going to die. What's the matter with you? Oh, yes, I am, I heard him say 102. People don't die with a temperature of 102. That's a silly way to talk. I know they do. At school in France, the boys told me you can't live with 44 degrees. I have Gora 102. He had been waiting to die all the day, ever since 9 o'clock in the morning. The joke is a neat one, but there is terror behind the joke, a glass dividing the perceptions of Schatz and his father. In The Killers, the old man waits for the killers to come. There is nothing he can do. This is not all there is to Hemingway's experiments with style and narration in the short story. In the stripping of the syntax, the repetition, the bareness of the vocabulary, the use of dialect, of a living idiom characteristic of the life he speaks of a hidden intention controlling his narration with the minimum of interference, Hemingway has, in a single, set the classic style of the modern short story. 4.5 Summing up. This unit has shown you that narration is one of the most important elements in a short story. Just as it would be wrong to assume that the short story, in its other basic elements, is a novel in miniature, it would be wrong to assume that the narrative method of the novel holds good for the short story also. Times the very brevity and compactness of the short story gives to its narrative style a particular direction. The major short story writers, even if they happen to be novelists, have discovered and practiced a different way of narration, as has been shown through the examples given in the unit. Thank you, subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.